Margaret Alden closed her hand around the thimble at her throat as the carriage passed beneath the gatehouse at Ashcombe Park, and she did not open her fingers again until the great doors stood shut behind her. Her mother had told her 3 times that morning not to speak of her father, and a 4th time in the carriage itself, as though the number of repetitions might be mistaken for the strength of the argument. The evening air came in through the window smelling of scythed hay and hot stone, the particular breathless smell of a summer that had not broken in 3 weeks, and somewhere off past the Lime Avenue a bell in the stable clock struck the half-hour, thin and correct, the only cool sound in all that heat. The thimble had been her father's. It was silver gone soft at the crown from 20 years of a hand pressing a needle through canvas, and on the underside, where no one would think to look unless they had been taught to look, were 2 letters cut so small they might have been a flaw in the metal rather than a mark left on purpose. T. A. Thomas Alden had wanted his daughter to have a trade a woman might keep even in reduced circumstances, and he had taught her himself, evenings by the fire, his own big hands absurdly careful over the small work, and he had told her once that a stitch was a kind of arithmetic, that thread added up the same as figures did, and that a dishonest hand always showed itself in the end, however patient it believed itself to be. He had been dead 6 years. In the 6 years since, Meg had learned to mend a hem so the eye could not find where the tear had been, to turn a worn collar so it showed its good face to the world, and to sit through an entire dinner without saying above 9 words, because her mother had discovered, in the wreck of their fortunes, that a quiet daughter drew less notice than a clever one, and less notice was, in Constance Alden's ledger of the world, the nearest thing left to safety. The house came up out of the trees, the way a ship comes up out of fog, stone by stone, window by lit window, and Meg thought, not for the first time, that a house so large must have a great deal to hide only because it had so many rooms to hide it in. Hetty had laced her into the good grey silk that afternoon, with her mouth full of pins, and her opinions kept, unusually, to herself, until the last hook was fastened, at which point she had stepped back, considered her handiwork, and said that Meg looked exactly like a young woman about to be asked a question she had not prepared an answer for. Meg had asked what question that might be. Hetty had only shaken out the hem, and said that if she knew that she would be dining at Ashcombe herself. And wasn't that a thought to frighten the both of them? It was Hetty who had stayed on at half wages after Thomas Alden died, and the household shrank to 2 women and a cottage with a leaking roof. Hetty, who had once been a laundress at a great house before she came to nurse Meg through the scarlet fever as a child, and had simply never left. And it was Hetty's particular gift to say the truest thing in any room, in a voice so dry that no one thought to be offended by it. In the carriage, Constance Alden had straightened Meg's glove for the 3rd time, and told her that the Duke of Harwick's grandmother would be present, that the Duke's man of business, Mr. Pruitt, would very likely be present, being nearly family at Ashcombe these 20 years, and that Meg was on no account to raise the subject of her father, his old position, his old friends, or anything at all belonging to the years before. "We do not speak of it," her mother said, and it was not the words themselves that Meg minded so much as the practised ease with which they came, as though they had been sanded smooth by use the way a stair-rail is worn pale by hands. Meg had asked, once, years ago, what exactly it was they did not speak of, and her mother's face had done something complicated and shut, like a window closing against weather, and she had never asked outright again, though the not asking had cost her something every single time. In the front hall of Ashcombe Park, under a painted ceiling of clouds and gilt figures that seemed entirely too pleased with themselves, Meg saw for one unguarded moment a tall, fair man standing apart from the gathering knot of guests near the drawing-room doors, his hands loosely clasped behind him, watching the room the way a man watches weather he cannot quite read yet, and beside him, a shade too close, a spare grey-haired man in good dark clothes, whose smile arrived a half-beat before his eyes agreed to it. Neither of them had been introduced to her yet. Both of them, in their different ways, were already looking at her. Meg closed her hand around the thimble once more, beneath her glove where no one could see it, and went in. The dining room at Ashcombe held 20 at table, and somehow managed to make the number feel like an accusation. All that polished mahogany running away into candlelight, and Meg found herself seated between an elderly clergyman who spoke exclusively of tithes, and a young woman named Selina Prewitt, who spoke hardly at all, and directly across from a small, unyielding woman in violet grey silk who was introduced, in a hush that told Meg everything she needed to know about the size of the woman's reputation, as the Dowager Duchess. The Duke himself sat some way down, near enough to observe, far enough that his attention seemed at first only a general courtesy paid to the whole table, rather than to any single guest at it. It was the Dowager who began it, turning her sharp bright eyes on Meg over the soup and asking, in the tone of a woman accustomed to answers arriving promptly, whether Miss Alden painted. "My daughter has some skill with a needle," Constance Alden said, before Meg's spoon had properly left the bowl, though she has had little leisure for painting, our circumstances being what they are, and it went on from there in a manner Meg had lived inside for 6 years, and had stopped, mostly feeling the shape of. Someone asked whether she rode. Her mother answered that the country near Fenbridge did not lend itself to riding, the roads being poor. Someone asked, kindly, whether she found the neighbourhood dull after wherever she had come from. Her mother answered that they found it perfectly suited to their quiet way of living. Meg ate her soup and watched the candle flames stand up straight in the still hot air, and thought that she might, by the end of the evening, have been discussed at some length by a table of 20 people, without once having used her own voice above a murmur of thanks to the footman refilling her glass. Selina Prewitt, beside her, said under the general noise that her uncle admired a woman who knew when to hold her tongue, and there was something in the flatness of it that made Meg glance sideways and find briefly, not envy, but something closer to warning. It was somewhere between the fish and the second remove that the Duke asked his one question, and afterward Meg understood that the whole table had gone quiet, not because anyone had signalled for quiet, but because everyone at Ashcombe already knew. The way a household knows the sound of its own front door, that when the Duke of Harwick addressed a single unrepeated question directly to a guest, he would ask it once, and would not ask another, and would form the whole of his opinion upon whatever came back. Miss Alden, he said, and his voice was not loud, which was itself a kind of authority, since every other voice at the table had to lower to hear it. Your mother tells us you have some skill with a needle. I wonder if you would tell me this instead. What is the smallest stitch you know how to make invisible? And how would you find it again, once it was sewn? Constance Alden's mouth opened. Meg watched it open, watched the shape of some safe, pleasant deflection already forming there, and for the first time in 6 years she spoke before her mother could. The finer the thread, your grace, the more even the hand must hold, stitch to stitch, she said, her own voice sounding strange to her in the sudden quiet, like a room she had not been into in years. A patient hand won't slip, but an impatient one always leaves one stitch shorter than its neighbours, no matter how well it hides the rest, and that is where I begin. When I am asked to mend something that was meant not to be found. Nobody at the table said anything for the length of perhaps 3 heartbeats. The dowager's eyebrows had gone up a fraction. Down the table, Josiah Pruitt's smile arrived a half-beat before his eyes agreed to it, and Meg, looking at neither of them, looked instead at the Duke, and found him not smiling at all, but watching her with the particular stillness of a man who has just heard something he had not expected to need. His thumb moved once along the edge of the card beside his plate, as though testing it for a blade it did not have, and then he inclined his head to her, the smallest possible acknowledgment, and turned the conversation elsewhere, and Meg understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the summer heat, that whatever she had just answered had mattered to him rather more than a dinner table. Riddle ought to. By the second week in July, the whole neighbourhood had heard some version of the Ashcombe question, most of them wrong in some particular, and Constance Alden moved through her own small rooms with the brittle brightness of a woman deciding, hour by hour, whether to be proud of her daughter or afraid for her. Fenbridge was not a large enough place to keep a good story quiet, and by market day Meg had been told, by 3 separate acquaintances, 3 separate versions of what she had said to the Duke of Harwick, none of which she recognised, though all of them agreed that she had said something, which was itself the scandal, since everyone knew the Alden girl did not speak at dinners. It was at market, among the stalls and the smell of crushed straw and overripe plums going soft in the heat, that Josiah Pruitt found her, apparently by accident, though Meg had lived long enough beside her mother's careful arrangements to recognise an accident too well constructed to be one. He complimented her answer at dinner, called it clever, called it, twice, remarkably self-possessed for a young lady in her circumstances, and there was nothing in the words themselves that a stranger could have taken exception to, and everything in the way he said circumstances that told Meg he meant something quite specific by it. Some families do well to let old business lie quiet, Miss Oldern, he said, turning a plum over in his fingers without buying it. The way a man turns over an argument he has already decided he will win. Your father understood that toward the end, I think. A pity you never had the chance to learn it from him directly. He set the plum down, unbought, and touched his hat, and was gone into the crowd before Meg had found any answer at all, which she understood afterward was precisely the point of having said it in a market crowd rather than a drawing-room, where an answer might have been required of him. That evening Edmund Fairley called, as he did most Thursdays, a solicitor's clerk from the next town, with a mild good face, and a habit of bringing exactly the right small kindness, a book, a paper of comfits for Hetty, a cutting from his mother's garden, and Constance Alden watched him across her mended tea-things, with the naked hope of a woman watching a door she very much needed to close well. Edmund was, by any honest accounting, a good match for a girl in Meg's position, steady, kind, unlikely ever to disappoint her in any way large enough to be noticed, and Meg liked him the way she liked a well-worn shawl, for its warmth and its familiarity, and the complete absence of surprise in it. He asked, gently, whether the Ashcombe dinner had gone well. Meg told him it had gone as well as could be expected of an evening in which she had been permitted to eat her own dinner. Edmund laughed, and did not press further, which was one of the things she was fondest of in him, and it was only after he had gone, the sound of his gig fading down the lane, that Meg turned to her mother in the low candlelight and asked the question she had swallowed whole 100 times since childhood. "What did happen to Papa?" she said. "Not the shape of it, the truth of it. Why Mr. Pruitt looks at me the way he does, and why you have never once, not once in 6 years, said his name at a table where it might be overheard." Constance Alden's hands went still over her work-basket, the mending forgotten in her lap, and for a moment something moved behind her face that Meg had never seen there before, something that looked less like shame than like fear standing very carefully still, so as not to be noticed. "We do not speak of it," her mother said, and there was no iron left in it this time, only exhaustion, only the sound of a woman repeating a sentence, because she had forgotten, long ago, that it was possible to say anything else. "Some things, once spoken, cannot be called back, Margaret. I have kept us safe by keeping still. Let that be enough for you." It was not enough. Meg sat with the thimble turning between her finger and thumb long after her mother had gone up to bed, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like grief arriving early, that whatever had happened to her father was not a closed door at all, but a door held shut by hand, and that someone was still, after 6 years, leaning their whole weight against it. The commission arrived from Ashcombe a fortnight later, carried by a groom in the Harwick livery, and it took Meg the better part of an hour to understand that it had been addressed to her directly and not to her mother, requesting, in a hand she would later come to know very well, that Miss Alden undertake the restoration of certain old bed-hangings and a set of needlework panels in the long gallery, her skill in such matters having been, the letter said with a dryness she suspected was deliberate, sufficiently and unusually demonstrated. Her mother's first instinct was alarm, her second was calculation, and by the time Meg had read the letter twice more, her mother had already decided that a paid commission from a duke was respectable in exactly the way that an unpaid attention from one was not, and so it was arranged, and twice a week through the worst of that dry summer Meg went up to the long gallery at Ashcombe with her. Workbox, and sat among panels of faded silk and old smoke-darkened wool, picking out rotten thread stitch by stitch, and setting new thread in its place, and more often than either of them had perhaps intended, the Duke came and sat with her. He did not hover. He brought correspondence of his own and read it in the window-seat while she worked, and for the first several visits they exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences between them in an afternoon, and Meg found, to her own quiet surprise, that the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way silence with strangers usually was, but companionable, the way the silence between two people working at the same table can be companionable, each absorbed in a different part of the same problem. It was in the 3rd week that he asked, nodding at the thimble where it had slipped free of her collar as she leaned over the frame, what the letters meant. "My father's," she said. "He taught me the work himself, which I understand is thought a strange thing for a man to have bothered with." Julian set down whatever paper he had been holding, and said that his own father had never taught him anything so useful as a stitch that could not be found again, only how to sit a horse, and how to read a rent roll without falling asleep over it, and that he had sometimes wondered, since inheriting both the house and the rolls 2 years past, whether the second skill had been worth the teaching, since the figures in Ashcombe's books had not, on close inspection, always agreed with themselves. He said it lightly, watching her rather than the window, and Meg understood that he had said it on purpose, the way a man drops a stone down a well to hear how far the water is. "I have been going through the estate accounts since my father died," he said, "further back than anyone expects a young duke to bother going, and I have found things in them I do not yet know how to explain to my own satisfaction." He did not say what things, and Meg, watching her needle rather than his face, did not ask, though something in her chest had gone very still and very alert, the way a hair goes still at a sound it cannot yet place. Their conversation was cut short that afternoon by Pruitt himself, arriving with a sheaf of papers requiring the Duke's signature, and a smile that arrived, as always, a half-beat before his eyes. And something closed in Julian's face the moment the older man entered, some door swinging shut on hinges Meg had not known were there. And she thought, watching it, that whatever the Duke suspected. He had not yet decided how far he trusted anyone in that house with the knowledge of it, herself included. That evening, at home, her mother was waiting up with news of her own, delivered in the particular bright, hard voice she used when she had decided something, and wished it to sound like Meg's own idea. Edmund Fairley had, that afternoon, all but declared his intentions to Constance Oldham directly, in the correct old-fashioned manner, asking leave to speak to Meg properly within the fortnight, and Constance had given her blessing before Meg had said a single word on the matter, because, her mother said, a girl in their position could not afford to let a good and certain thing wait upon a duke's passing fancy for embroidered bed. Hangings. Meg thought of Julian's stillness in the window-seat, of the way he had said found things I do not yet know how to explain, as though he had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to help him explain them, and she thought of Edmund's mild, kind face, and the safety of him, and she said, because it was easier than saying anything true, that she would give Edmund her answer within the month. Her mother kissed her forehead and called her a sensible girl, and Meg went to bed with the thimble pressed hard into her closed palm, and did not sleep for a long while, listening to the dry wind working at the thatch outside like a hand searching for a loose thread. It was Hetty who first said the words that changed everything, and she said them the way she said most important things, sideways, over the ironing, as though she had not noticed the weight of what she was setting down. "Your father kept a second book," she said, in his last year. "Private, mind, not the estates. I saw him at it by candlelight the week before he took ill, writing away like a man settling a debt with himself, and when I asked what it was he only said it was nothing yet, and would be something soon, God willing." Meg had gone quite still over her own mending. "A second book," she said. "What became of it? Hetty set the iron down on its heel, and considered the question with the particular caution of a woman deciding how much truth a room could hold. "Your mother has his old work-basket still," she said at last. "Up in the cottage attic, behind the trunk, wrapped against the damp. I never saw her open it, not once in 6 years, though I've seen her stand in front of it some evenings, like a woman standing before a grave she hasn't the nerve to kneel at. If there was a book, that's where I'd look first, and I'd look quiet, because your mother has her reasons for the quiet, whatever we think of them." Meg asked carefully what Hetty herself believed those reasons to be. Hetty picked up a shirt of Meg's, examined a seam, and said that a stain scrubbed at only in secret only ever sets deeper, that water wants to see a thing plainly before it will lift clean, and that in her long experience the people most afraid of a truth coming out were rarely the people who had done the wrong in the first place. "That is your mother, my girl, not because she is guilty of anything, but because somebody put the fear of God into her once, and fear like that doesn't need feeding twice. It just sits there in the corner, getting fatter on its own." Meg turned this over for 3 days, before she found the courage to go up to the cold attic, under the cottage eaves, where the heat of that endless summer sat, trapped and thick under the slates, and she found the work-basket exactly where Hetty had said it would be, small and plain and wrapped in a length of oiled sacking that had gone stiff with age. She did not open it that first evening. She only turned it over in her hands, feeling for its shape the way she had been taught, to feel for the shape of a repair beneath a garment's good face. And it was there, running her thumb along the base, that she felt it. A line of stitching along the lining, tight and even and entirely wrong. Not her mother's careless mending hand, not a shop's neat machine even seam. But something stitched once, hard, by someone anxious to be finished before he was interrupted. A masculine hand, uneven where a woman's would have run smooth, one stitch shorter than its neighbours no matter how well the rest of the row had been made to hide it. Her own words, spoken across a dinner table weeks before, came back to her with a coldness that raised the hair on her arms. She wrapped the basket again exactly as she had found it, and carried it downstairs to her own room, and set it at the bottom of her clothes press. And that same week, unable to bear the waiting any longer, she went to the one man in Ashcombe, who might tell her the truth without pretending to be kind about it, and found Josiah Pruitt in the estate office, going over his rent books by the light of 2 candles, though the sun outside had not yet properly set. He received her courteously, offered her a chair, and when she asked him plainly what had truly happened in her father's last year at Ashcombe, he did not deny that something had. There was a shortfall in the rents that year, Miss Alden, a serious one, he said, setting down his pen, and folding his hands with the calm of a man who has told this particular story many times, and improved it with each telling. Your father kept the books. Someone had to answer for the figures not adding, and your father, God rest him, was already a sick man by autumn, too unwell to defend himself through the long inquiry the old Duke wished to hold. And I persuaded his Grace that a quiet dismissal, with a small pension continued for the widow, would spare your family a public ruin far worse than a private one. I am not a cruel man, Miss Alden. I am an arithmetical one, which the young so often mistake for cruelty. Your father may have erred through carelessness rather than intent, I have never said otherwise, but an estate the size of this one cannot survive an inquiry that drags on for years arguing the difference. I did what I believed merciful. Meg left the office with her hands cold despite the heat, carrying his reasonableness like a stone in her pocket, and it was not until she was home again, alone in her own small room with the work-basket open at last on her knee, and the false lining picked free stitch by stitch beneath her patient fingers, that her fingers found, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a scrap of faded ribbon she recognised at once. Because its twin still hung about her own throat, the small worn packet her father had hidden there before he died. The storm broke that night, the first rain in 3 weeks, and Meg sat by her window with her father's private book open in her lap, while the thunder walked slowly across the roof, and the dry gutters ran suddenly loud with water, and she read her father's cramped, careful hand by candlelight, the way Hetty must once have watched him write it. It was not a confession. It was the opposite of a confession, page after page of figures set beside figures, rents collected against rents recorded, 3 years of small discrepancies that grew, quarter upon quarter, into a sum too large to be carelessness, each entry dated and initialled in her father's own steady script. And on the second to last page, in ink gone brown with age, a single line that she read 3 times before she understood the whole shape of what had been done to him. shown to no one yet. Must lay this before his grace directly, before Michaelmas, whatever it costs me. He had never reached Michaelmas. He had been dismissed in disgrace for the very theft he had been quietly, patiently proving against another man, and the shock and the shame of it, arriving before he could speak, had broken something in him that the illness of that winter had only finished. Meg was still sitting with the book open on her knee, the candle burned low, when her mother's shadow fell across the doorway, and Constance Alden, seeing what lay open in her daughter's lap, made a small sound like a woman struck, and came into the room and sat down hard upon the end of the bed, as though her legs had simply stopped answering her. "I knew," her mother said, before Meg could ask, the words coming out of her flat and exhausted, as though a great weight long carried had finally been set down badly, all at once, rather than lowered with any care. "I have always known your father never touched a penny that was not his. Proet came to me himself, the week after the funeral, and told me that if I ever spoke a word of doubt against the settled account, he would see to it we lost the cottage, the pension, the last good name we had left to lose, and I was a widow with a daughter of 15, and no one in the world to stand behind me if I fought him. So I chose the silence. And I have gone on choosing it every single day since, because a coward's silence, once begun, becomes very hard to put down." Meg had no chance to answer her, because it was in that same hour, with the storm still working overhead, that Edmund Fairley arrived, soaked through and apologetic, having ridden over in the rain to keep the promise Meg herself had made him a month before, to give him her answer, and he found her white-faced and shaking over an open book, with her mother weeping quietly on the bed beside her, and though he asked nothing of the scene in front of him, Meg saw him understand, with the quick, unhappy grace of a genuinely good man, that whatever answer she had been going to give him, it was not the one he had ridden through a storm to hear. "I think I already know," he said, before she could find the words to spare him. "You need not say it tonight, Meg. I would rather carry the disappointment a little longer than watch you lie to soften it." He left before the rain had eased, and Meg sat afterward with the book closed in her lap and the ribbon retied around it, and understood that she now held the one thing that could clear her father's name before the whole county, and had no possible way to use it without dragging her mother's 6 years of frightened silence into the same light, and without, very likely, losing every soft thing that had begun, so carefully and so slowly, in the long gallery at Ashcombe. Word travels faster in a small county than any rider can carry it, and by the week's end it had reached the Dowager Duchess, in some garbled shape, that the Alden girl had been seen leaving the steward's office white as a sheet, and that her mother had been heard weeping in the village shop over some old business best left buried, and Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Harwick, was not a woman who required more than a garbled shape to begin drawing her own very precise conclusions. She called Meg to her at the Dower House, a small formidable interview conducted over cooling tea that neither of them touched, and told her, without preamble, that she had made inquiries of her own the moment her grandson's interest in a penniless clerk's daughter became impossible to ignore, and that what she had learned inclined her to think Miss Alden a young woman with rather more to hide than to offer. "I read people for my living, in a manner of speaking," the Dowager said, her spine perfectly straight against a chair that did not require such straightness. "I have vetted every young woman my grandson has so much as danced with twice, and I do not apologize for it. Because a duke's wife is not a private happiness, she is a public office, and I will not see that office go to a girl whose own mother cannot answer a simple question honestly across a dinner table." Meg, who had come prepared to be humble and left the interview instead with her chin up, said that her mother's silence at that dinner had cost the family a great deal more than the Duchess supposed, and that she would say no more on the matter until she was ready to say all of it to everyone who needed to hear it, at once. The Duchess's eyes narrowed with something that was not quite approval yet, but was no longer quite contempt either. It was that same week that Julian, hearing his own version of the gossip, and hearing besides from his own solicitor a small strange rumour that a private ledger belonging to the late Thomas Alden had surfaced somewhere in the neighbourhood, did the thing that afterward cost them both the most. He came to the cottage himself, refused Hetty's offer of tea, and told Meg, standing rather than sitting, that he thought it best, for her own protection, if their acquaintance were to lapse until certain estate matters he could not yet discuss were properly settled. "I would not have scandal touch you before I have the means to answer it properly," he said, his thumb moving once along the edge of his hat brim, as though testing it for a blade it did not have. "It is not what I wish, Meg. I hope you will believe that much of me." She did not believe it, not in that moment, standing in her mother's small parlour, with her father's book locked in the press upstairs, and her whole chest gone hollow with the particular grief of watching a door close from the inside by the very hand she had thought would hold it open. She thought he had heard the same rumours as his grandmother, and drawn the same convenient conclusion, that a family with secrets was a family not worth the risk, and she said, in a voice she was rather proud of afterward for its steadiness, that he need not trouble himself explaining his own convenience to her, and that she wished him good evening. He left without another word, and Meg climbed the stairs afterward and sat for a long while with the work-basket open before her, and the storm long past, and nothing left outside but a flat white heat that seemed, that week, to have settled permanently over the whole county. It was Selina Pruitt, of all people, who came to her 2 days later, slipping in at the garden gate with her bonnet pulled low, and said without any preamble at all that her uncle meant to have the ledger destroyed before it could be laid before witnesses, that she had heard him say as much to his clerk, and that she was telling Meg this not out of any love for the Aldens, but because she was tired, herself, of being raised inside a house built on a lie she had never chosen, and could not any longer pretend not to see. "I will not be blamed for what he did," Selina said, her hands twisting together in a way that suggested the visit had cost her more courage than Meg had credited her with. "But I will not help hide it either. Not any more. Do what you mean to do quickly, Miss Alden, before he has the chance to make quite sure there is nothing left to do it with." Meg thanked her, and watched her go, and sat alone afterward in the low kitchen with the thimble held so tightly in her closed fist that its worn edge left a small pale mark across her palm, and understood that whatever was to be done now would have to be done by her, and done in the open, before the whole county, or not done at all. The quarter-day audit had been fixed weeks before, long before any of this had broken loose, a plain annual gathering of tenants and stewards and the Duke's own household in the great hall at Ashcombe to settle the rents and hear the year's accounts read aloud, and Meg arrived at it uninvited, in her one good grey silk, with her father's book wrapped in its ribbon and carried openly in both hands rather than hidden in any reticule, because she had decided, somewhere in the sleepless small hours before dawn, that whatever came of this, she would not do it as her mother had done everything for 6 years, quietly, and from behind a closed door. The hall was full when she entered, tenants and their wives along the benches, the dowager seated near the dais with her spine perfectly straight, Pruitt already on his feet, with his own ledgers open before the Duke, mid-sentence in some familiar recitation of a good year's figures. And it was Edmund Fairley, standing quietly near the door, with a leather folder under his arm, who caught her eye first and gave her the smallest nod. The nod of a man who had ridden over that morning of his own accord to bring something he had found, at some cost to his own pride. In his master's old parish and estate archive, a signed and witnessed record from the year of Thomas Alden's dismissal, showing that no formal inquiry had ever, in fact, been minuted, contrary to what Pruitt had told the old Duke and every soul in the county since. "Your Grace," Meg said, and the whole hall turned, and her voice did not shake though her hands, holding the book, very nearly did. "I believe your steward has read you a year's figures that agree very well with each other. I have a book here that will not agree with his at all, and I should like it read aloud, so that everyone in this hall hears the same words at the same moment, and no one afterward can say they heard a different story than their neighbour did." Julian rose from his chair. "Read it," he said, and there was nothing in his voice but the stillness of a man who had been waiting, without knowing quite what for, since the day a dinner-table answer first told him this was a woman worth waiting for. Meg read her father's figures aloud, quarter by quarter, and set them, page by page, beside the very ledger Pruitt himself had just finished reading from. And the hall grew very quiet in the particular way a room grows quiet when it begins, all together, to understand the shape of something it had been told for years to leave alone. A ledger is a kind of confession, her father had written once, in the margin of an early page, if you know how to read the hand that kept it, and Meg read that line aloud too, and looked up, and found Pruitt's face gone the colour of old paper. He might even then have salvaged something with silence, but it was Julian who set the two ledgers side by side upon the long table, and asked him, quite gently, to explain to the room why the same quarter's rents appeared £11 heavier in one book than in the other, 3 years running, and it was in reaching, too fast, across the table to snatch the older book back before anyone else could turn its pages, that Josiah Pruitt gave himself away entirely, his hand closing on empty air, where the Duke had already lifted the ledger out of his reach. There was a silence then that Meg would remember for the rest of her life, and into it Pruitt said, quietly, that he had never meant the shortfall to fall on an innocent man, that the estate had nearly gone under in a bad harvest year decades past, and he had covered the gap however he could, and gone on covering it, because stopping had come to seem more dangerous than continuing, and that Thomas Alden's illness that autumn had simply made him the easiest name to set against the figures. A mercy, he had told himself at the time, sparing a dying man a long public inquiry he would not have lived to see the end of. He looked, for just a moment, at his niece where she stood pale near the back wall, and something moved in his face that was almost grief. And then it was gone, and he asked only, with what dignity remained to him, to be permitted to withdraw from the estate's service before the room decided anything further on his behalf. The Dowager Duchess rose to her feet, unassisted, faced the hall, and said, in a voice that did not waver, that she had judged Miss Alden a fortnight before, on gossip alone, and had been entirely wrong to do so, and that she would say so publicly now, precisely because she had been wrong publicly first. The hall began, slowly, to empty, tenants murmuring to each other in the low, urgent way of people who have just watched history rearrange itself in front of them, and Meg stood at the long table with her father's book still open under her hand, and looked up, and found Julian already looking at her, and neither of them, for the length of several long breaths, said anything at all. He found her afterward in the long gallery, among the very panels she had spent that whole hot summer mending, and the light coming through the tall windows had gone soft and gold with early evening, in the way it does after a storm has finally cleared the air of a season. I sent you away because I was afraid of what would happen to you if the scandal broke before I had proof enough to answer it, he said without preamble, his thumb moving once along the edge of a folded paper he was not even reading, and then, seeming to notice the habit for the first time, he let the paper fall closed on the table and did not pick it up again. I told myself it was protection. I understand now it looked, from where you stood, exactly like shame. It was, Meg said, and did not soften it, because she had decided, somewhere in the reading aloud of her father's figures, that she was done softening true things for the comfort of the person hearing them. You told me once that a patient man doesn't slip, Your Grace, and that an impatient one always leaves one stitch shorter than the rest. You were not impatient with me. You were only afraid, and you let the fear speak in your place, the very way my mother let hers speak in mine, at your own table, the first night we met. Julian was quiet a long moment, and then he laughed briefly, without much humour in it, and said that he supposed he had been rather thoroughly out-argued by his own dinner question, which seemed a fitting enough end to it. I am asking you properly this time, he said, and there was nothing careful left in his voice at all. Not one question with a clever answer, only the plain one. Will you have me, Margaret Alden, knowing exactly what your answer will cost you in this county, and exactly what it will cost me, and knowing that I would rather have both those costs than one more year without you in this house? I will, Meg said. And then, because she had also decided that a plain declaration deserved plain conditions laid beside it, she told him what she would require of him before she would say it before witnesses, that her father's name be entered, in the Duke's own hand, into Ashcombe's own permanent record, cleared and dated, so that no future steward could ever again quietly rewrite what had truly happened that autumn. That Selina Pruitt be given an independent provision of her own, untouched by her uncle's disgrace, so that the girl who had risked something small to help a stranger would not be made to pay for a crime she had never chosen, and that she would go on with her needle and her restorer's eye even as a duchess, because it was hers, earned rather than given, and she would not set it down for anyone's comfort, his grandmother's least of all. Julian agreed to every term before she had finished stating the last of them, and told her, with the particular dryness she would come to know very well over the following 40 years, that a duke who could not agree to such reasonable conditions had no business asking for a wife with an eye that sharp in the first place. They were married before the leaves turned, in the small stone church at Fembridge, with Hetty weeping loudly in the second pew, and pretending she was not, and Edmund Fairley stood as a guest rather than a mourner, and made, at the wedding breakfast, one dry small joke at his own expense that made the whole table laugh and cost him, Meg suspected, rather more than it appeared to. A year turned, quietly, the way years do once the worst of a story is behind them, and on a hot, bright morning very like the one that had opened it, a carriage came up the lime avenue and passed beneath the Ashcombe gatehouse. And this time it was Meg's own hand on the door before the groom could reach it, and the small girl beside her, Selina's own daughter, newly apprenticed to her needlework and full of questions about the panels in the long gallery, leaned out to watch the grey heron standing motionless at the edge of the ornamental mere, exactly where it had always stood, exactly as still. Meg lifted the thimble from where it hung, openly now, outside her collar rather than beneath it, and let the child turn it over in her small fingers, and read the 2 letters cut into the underside of the silver. That was his mark, Meg told her, so it could never be mistaken for anyone else's work. A stitch you're proud of, you sign. A stitch you're ashamed of, you try to hide. And it always shows anyway, 1 stitch shorter than the rest. Her mother, walking beside them up the drive with her own hand resting easy now on Meg's arm, said only that it was a fine warm morning for coming home, and did not, for the first time in Meg's whole memory of her, feel the need to say anything more careful than that. If this one settled somewhere warm in you tonight, stay by the fire a little longer before you go. I keep thinking of that 1 crooked stitch Meg found by Feel alone, and of Selina slipping in at the garden gate with her bonnet pulled low, and I would love to know which moment stayed with you longest, so tell me in the comments below, and while you're there, settle in properly, and subscribe to Extra Ciao H channel _name EH, so you never miss the next one lighting up when the evenings draw in. The kettle's still warm, and there's another story waiting just past it. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to somebody tomorrow.